Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Good afternoon. I suggest we open this session. I'd like to express our gratitude to the organizers for this opportunity given to myself and my colleagues to be present here. Thank you very much. As to the topics we're going to discuss today, our main goal is to discuss the general macroeconomic situation in Russia, the limitations on growth, and recommendations on overcoming them. Furthermore, we'll also go to more detailed discussion to discuss sectoral and regional aspects of economic growth. The main presentation will be made by our colleagues from OECD, and the first presentation is going to be in English, so I'm going to speak English in a moment.
Main presentation is devoted to several important topics. Firstly, general macroeconomic outlook for the Russian economy, then potential growth and structural policy priorities. We will also touch the topic of productivity growth and income inequality, and also our colleagues will discuss the issues on the drivers of the economic growth on regional level. Please. Откройте, пожалуйста, презентацию основную.
Okay, thank you very much, Polina, for the introduction, and many thanks for the organizers to make it possible to present the overview on the Russian economy. I want to bring the Russian economy forward, but I don't succeed.
С переключением.
Okay, the OECD and Russia are involved in a common monitoring project for the years 2017 and 2018, which involves several activities. The first one is regular projections, twice yearly projections of the GDP and the main underlying drivers. The second one is a once yearly analysis of structural reforms and especially reform needs. And then the third, more specific program, which involves several projects which are particularly dedicated to the Russian economy, involving projects on productivity, on inequality, on oil dependency and diversification of the economy, on energy efficiency, and finally on regional growth. The different parts of this monitoring program will be presented jointly with Russian researchers in a joint OECD Russia seminar somewhere October or November of 2018. Now I'm going quickly through the different... Sorry. lower or farther away? Lower, okay. Okay, first, a quick overview on the economic outlook. The Russian economy is now recovering from the deep slump around the years 2015 and 2016. The recovery is rather broad-based. It involves both the consumptive and the investment part of the economy. Now households are finally also picking up against contributing to GDP. We project that the recovery reaches its peak somewhere end of 2017, now beginning of 2018, and then slows down a bit to reach potential growth of around 1%, 1.5% during 2018 and during 2019. Again, you see that the growth rates projected for the next 2 years are clearly below the growth we had in the period from 2010 until 2014. The macroeconomic environment, or the monetary environment, is rather looking well. Both inflation and interest rates are coming down. Inflation is clearly below the short-term interest rates, meaning that the real interest rates are rather high. Is an advantage to attract capital into the country, has a disadvantage that it still puts a drag on the growth of the economy. Overall, the fiscal position is stable. Russia has one of the lowest public debt to GDP ratios of OECD countries, and it's even slightly coming down. Most of the debt is ruble denominated, so little exposure to foreign debt. The budget deficit, which increased after 2014, is now coming down, which is actually good because one of the reasons that debt is so low is that Russia could tap the wealth fund, which is now exhausted. So if budget deficits are continuing, they would have to be financed through additional debt. They can't be longer financed through the wealth fund. Now, overall, if we take these points together, growth is recovering. However, we have to say it's partly driven by temporary factors, mainly strong credit growth by households, and also strong growth of public investment, which is probably not sustainable for the next 1 or 2 years. We think that overall the monetary policy is on the right path. It could be a little bit less tight, but on the other hand, it means it should remain vigilant. Inflation expectations in Russia still are not very well anchored, so the central bank has to navigate a bit between being tight and between less tight. Overall, we think that the central bank is doing quite a good job. One point is there is a new fiscal rule introduced beginning of 2017. It underpins consolidation very well. It is connected to the oil price, meaning that if oil prices, or if the actual oil price is above a certain level, then the additional revenues go into the wealth fund, are sterilized. There is also a more active part of the fiscal rule, which means that which involves foreign exchange interventions. We think it's something which can be done. It brings back a little bit through the back door foreign exchange interventions which the central bank gave up a few years ago. It also means that in Russia you now have 2 institutions that are doing foreign exchange interventions, the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, which at some times could create tensions between the 2 institutions in the future. So what is the right foreign exchange interventions? It would have to be coordinated. Usually foreign exchange interventions are the business of the central bank. Now going more to the structural part of the Russian economy. As we see, the macroeconomic environment is quite stable. In our general opinion, the issues pertaining to the Russian economy lie more on the structural rather than on the macroeconomic side. A picture which we find always quite impressive is the declining growth, the declining rate of potential growth. It came down from around 7 or 8% in the early 2000s and is now reaching around 1 to 1.5% currently. We think that potential growth of the Russian economy is around 1 or 1.5%. The decline of this potential growth is mainly driven by the declining, what we call total factor productivity, so the productivity of the economy. Other factors have remained quite stable. The investment rate has remained stable. The capital per worker has remained stable. So the main driver is really the declining productivity, and one of the main issues pertaining to the future growth of the economy is really how do we rise productivity. It's not only an issue in Russia, but it's an issue in almost every OECD country, but it's a particular issue in Russia. Now, what are the priorities to address this productivity issue? If we compare it to the other OECD, or if you compare it to OECD countries, if you look at this graph, you may see that the main issues pertain to what we call business climate or the business environment. If you divide up the priorities between what concerns firms, what concerns the workers or the employees, and what concerns skills, the main issue in Russia concerns the firms, the business climate, the business environment. What are those priorities which are summarized in the Going for Growth exercise? You can go back and look at them in this publication. If we sum them up, we would say that the first is lower the barriers to foreign direct investment. Other OECD colleagues here are currently presenting the Code of Liberalization. That's one aspect of lower the barriers to foreign direct investment. It's a competitive environment, foster competition, and foster a level playing field between public and private firms. That's a big issue in Russia. Reduce public ownership and state involvement in the business operations. And improve the governance of the state-owned enterprises, so that again pertains to the relationship between the public and the private sector and the way public enterprises are run. Support innovation policy, make research and business cooperate more. I remember last year's Gaidar Forum and the workshop on a report on innovation policy, which was called "Sleeping Up the Russian Giants," which was about how to improve innovation within Russian firms, and the policy that could support such research, such innovation. Several people mentioned that other OECD countries, especially Germany and Switzerland, had much stronger relationship or fostered relationship between the business sector and the research institutes. And the answer from the panel was, this is not a Russian model. Maybe it should become a Russian model, a stronger cooperation between the business sector and research institutes. Finally, improve the quality of public administration, which is a general recommendation on improving the efficiency and productivity of the different state sectors. Now, getting into the five specific projects we are dealing at the OECD, which are or should be of different, of specific interest to the Russian economy. It's an overall program involving 5 projects. The first one is, as productivity is such an important issue, it deals with the productivity at the firm level. If you compare productivity of firms across different countries, we see that it has evolved differently in the various countries, and that Russia, the productivity of Russian firms has lagged behind the productivity of firms in France, Germany, and Great Britain. If we start in the year 2004, everybody is at 100. Productivity rose much less or even declined in Russia than in the other countries. So that's kind of a starting point of our research. There's also one specific interesting point and a bit an unpleasant point. If we look at the firms by their age when they leave the economy, when they die, when they go bankrupt, and if we compare their productivity, of course, every firm that leaves the market declines in productivity. That's shown by all these curves. That's logical. If your productivity declines below a certain level, finally you have to leave the market. The unpleasant thing here is that even those firms that remain in the market over 5, 10, 15 or 20 years have that declining curve, which means that over time all the Russian firms have become less productive. Not only those that left the market, but also those that remain within the market. Another project concerns also a specific Russian issue, the dependence on oil, what we call the resource curse and growth. If we make a simple correlation or relationship between long-term average growth and the dependence on natural resources, oil or gas in that case, we see that the less that dependence, or the higher that dependence, the lower the long-term growth. Russia is a bit an exception. You see Russia is above the trend line. But if you take all the oil exporting countries, we see that there is a relationship between growth and oil dependence, and it's negative. Now we have done quite an extensive empirical research to see what affects that relationship. Does it hold if we introduce other factors, if we introduce institutional environment, other factors that could affect long-term growth? And our findings are indeed that countries with a large oil exporting sector are growing less, at least over the last 25 years. There are some policy measures that can mitigate that relationship. A well-done fiscal policy can mitigate the impact of oil price shocks. That's actually what the Russian central bank did in 2015, and they did it quite successfully. Other countries also did it over the 25 years, partially successfully. Now, in the long run, what we find out is that fixed exchange rates seem more favorable for oil exporters, but this is less pertinent for diversified countries like Russia. You have to imagine that many of those oil exporters are small countries that almost entirely depend on oil, and which don't have really an own independent monetary policy. They are more or less dollarized. That's reflected in this relationship. So for small countries, for very small oil exporters, it might be useful to have a fixed exchange rate. For the larger and more diversified countries like Russia, it's probably not as useful, and indeed the the floating exchange rate after the oil price shock in 2015 was a more successful policy than if the central bank had kept the ruble constant over that period. The conclusion is very clear. It's good to have oil as a revenue source, but the diversification of exports and the diversification of the overall economy is crucial for long-term growth. The third project is on income inequality. Just a very quick overview. Income inequality is high in Russia. However, we have to say it's lower than in the United States, and it's lower than in some Latin American countries which are OECD members like Mexico or Chile. And it did not rise further after the 2009 crisis. It has increased rapidly in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. Now it's more or less stable or even slightly declining. What could explain this high income inequality? There are different potential explanations. As we have seen in our productivity exercise, productivity differences across Russian firms and across workers are large. They're larger than in other countries. The informal sector is considerable, and informality usually is associated with higher inequality. The minimum wage in Russia is rather low. The salaries for the public sector, for the public servants, are rather modest, and the size of pensions and the size of other social benefits is rather low. And very often they're not really targeted at those that need it most. A fourth project concerns energy efficiency and what we call green growth, so a growth that uses environmentally friendly energy sources. Russia's energy efficiency is low if you take just primary energy consumption in relation to GDP. In the last 2 years, Russia uses quite a lot of energy to produce its GDP, even more than some other emerging market countries like India or Indonesia. You can also look at it from the angle of what is the composition of the energy production, how much renewable energy is used. That share is increasing in the OECD countries, but it's not increasing or even declining in Russia. So this is also an aspect we want to look at. We want to develop a model, to assess the impacts of energy efficiency on GDP, and to assess what is the growth of energy efficiency improvements and what is the influence of international energy prices on the benefits of improving energy efficiency. Energy efficiency has a lot to do with prices, which in Russia's case means oil prices. So what sense does it actually make to improve energy efficiency, given that the oil prices can be either low, medium, or high? And the fifth project, and this is the moment where I'm handing over to my colleague Olivier, we want to assess the drivers of growth in Russia's region, a model specifically, a regional growth model specifically calibrated to the region, to the Russian regions. Thank you very much.
Будьте добры. Thank you very much for coming here. I'm going to speak about this model. Our goal was to establish the reasons for what are the drivers for GDP growth in Russian regions. If we look at the starting point, you will see that regional inequality in Russia is quite great compared to OECD countries. You can see the GRP per capita disparities, and you will see that it's very high in Russia. Of course, Russia is a multi-regional country, but we weight the indicator by population size. So the size of the population doesn't affect the findings. Inequality is great. We asked the following questions. What factors affect GRP per capita growth? And there have been other studies of initial factors, basic factors underlying growth, such as regional peculiarities, policies, and regional decentralization. I'm not even quoting other studies. They have been so large in number. In our review, we were interested in the role of regional fiscal policies, specifically the level of spending and the structure of spending and revenue in each region. We used the modeling frameworks that are quite similar to those created in OECD to study national fiscal policy. We used this model, for instance, to in other OECD country studies. Fournier and Johnson a report contains a description of these models. As to regional characteristics, regional factors and statistics were borrowed from Rosstat, available on the web, as well as some information from Treasury data. We covered 76 regions, and we excluded Moscow city and St. Petersburg because their fiscal characteristics are quite different because they're cities, so they differ greatly from other regions. We also excluded some regions such as Chukotka and Nenets autonomous district. The time span we covered is not so great. It's from 2004 to 2015, since some statistics wasn't available over a greater span of time. Our main focus was on regional growth of regional GDP growth. We used Rosstat's GDP statistics and used those annual figures like Bayesian. Our base year was 2010, so GDP we used the Rosstat figures for GDP growth in 2010 as a starting point. We used a correction model. If you look at those squares in the bottom of the slide, the idea was that GDP per capita arrives at a certain long-term trajectory, and there is a way to calculate this trajectory. And we believe that this trajectory is determined by education and investment. On the other hand, there are short-term shocks that we treat as interactions. For instance, we show that industrial regions with a large share of industrial input into GDP will suffer more from slowdown in global economic growth. We also wanted to identify region. We separated energy-producing regions that are highly dependent on global energy prices. And finally, regions with a very high level of debt indebtedness will be, those regions will be dependent on interest rates. And finally, we identified characteristics that don't change over time. For instance, the input of natural resources or agricultural production in regional GDP. So that's the model we used. So we sort of excluded policy factors from economic growth. And then we wanted to use factors, coefficients that are policy dependent. We had two model methods for assessing the models. We used non-fixed effects because those might have affected our measurements. There is a famous study by Barrow in 2014 that showed that it should be used without fixed effects. There is also another model, a generalized moments method, that we used as well. As to our findings, we only have interim results at this point. Apparently, convergence GDP rate over time is close to 2% of the golden rule. 2% is more or less the same as the golden rule, which many empirical cross-country studies have found. Interestingly, it's not unlike the results we had for OECD countries. In other words, the comparison of regions in Russia compare to each other in the same way as OECD countries compare to each other. The potential, of course, is dependent by investment and other characteristics, such as the share of extraction sectors in the regional economy. We also looked at factors of short-term GRP growth and established that industrial regions were more vulnerable than others to alternations in global growth. And in recent years, industrial regions are those that were the most vulnerable among Russian regions, are the worst hit among Russian regions by the global economic crisis. We also noted that regions with large debt were vulnerable to interest rate variation. But we did not fail to see that oil prices affected regions with a high share of energy production. So that's not an important factor. Migration, we also looked at migration. As to fiscal policies, our study has shown that high spending by regions can be associated with lower growth. But we also showed that if you look at overall the total of federal and regional spending, this leads to a considerable increase in growth rate. So regional spending appears to be more effective than federal spending as far as regional growth is concerned. If we look at the so-called correlation coefficient, convergence coefficient, what we can see is it's between 0.2 to 2%. We have not established that the level of education has any effect on GDP growth, but it's also the same for OECD. As to investment, it's a little more important in OECD countries than in Russian regions. And also we have shown that the share of industrial output, when it grows with global growth, it will have a positive input into regional GDP. And this is baseline. This is as far as policy factors are concerned. Again, education hardly plays a role. We also have investment. And in the fourth line, that shows the effect of regional spending on regional product, we see that there is a negative, there is a minor negative effect. But if you look at public spending, public investment, we can see that it depends on the model, of course, but there's also some positive effect from consolidated regional budget spending. It shows on, doesn't show on either of the progressions. There are two more interesting things. As we can see, regional prices are significant. Regional prices define regional subsistence level, and they also affect budget spending on regional product. In other words, this spending can be quite considerable, but it's important. And when regional prices are high, the regional public spending will be high too, in as much as social spending is concerned. And these factors do reflect a little on the living standards in the region. We also further additional calculations yield that extra investment does not have a big effect compared to total investment. However, this investment is not very high in Russian economy generally. When we looked at the effect of those investments on regional product, and if you consider the share it has in regional economy, we were able to show that about 1% of extra investment only adds 0.25% to growth. If the investment comes from other than regional budgets, it will add an extra 0.35% to growth. In future, we're going to look at the role of regional policies on long-term growth and sustainability of growth. We also are going to look at the consequences of recent reductions of budget spending transfers to regions and what effects that's going to have on regional growth. We are going to also discuss today what future studies we ought to conduct. We might look at use the same models to study other factors, such as the correlation between spending and revenues and long-term factors that we consider to be very interesting and that we often study in OECD countries, such as education and innovation. I attended a presentation about innovative regions yesterday, and in a packed room, I must say. They were talking about various regional factors of innovation potential. So we wanted to consider these factors and whether these factors have a strong impact on regional growth. That's it. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, уважаемые коллеги. Прежде чем открыть...
Colleagues, before we start this question and answers, I would like to ask some follow-up questions to our speakers. First of all, the most important topic was about potential growth. Our colleagues from Oecd described, in fact, a very sad picture of potential growth lower than 1% by 2030. I would like to ask the question, what is your evaluation of potential growth? what about demographic factor, and what can we do in a long-term perspective? Thank you. I support the attention that OECD colleagues pay to potential growth and the focus on this potential growth. Unfortunately, when we developed economic programs in our Russia, we didn't use systemically these factors, but as a result, we often observe that some programs promise very easy growth thanks to different simulating measures, and we can predict even 5–9% per year. And from this point of view, these real indicators shown today just return us to the grounds. So we understand that increasing and potential growth is a very difficult task. As for concrete indicators and pessimistic predictions that were shown today, and this is declining of potential growth. This is about 0.5%. In this year, we hesitate about the results. First of all, potential growth as compared to economic growth is not very dynamic indicator. Recently, OECD countries evaluated this 1.5%, though it's not as much, but still not as low as 0.5%. According to our evaluations, we have this indicator 1.5%. What are our arguments in favor of more feasible and realistic evaluation? In reports of our colleagues from OECD, it was marked that Russia conducts very slow structural reforms. They could be more dynamic. And I do agree that structured reforms is a very important factor of changing potential and providing potential growth. And I think that if we are not active enough in structural reforms, then the growth will become slower. But I'm not as sure that the choice of the only benchmark as initial level is not correct. I think that active reforms allow to increase potential growth. If we provided or conducted all these reforms that OECD suggested, then perhaps our growth would be higher. I think that passive policy conserves, in fact, the situation, but does not lead to decline to zero. And still, if we can assume that our potential growth is declining, it can only mean that it could be increased very quickly. Then it brings us to the idea that we have to look at different scenarios. It may depend on the government policy, and correspondingly, in my opinion, if we have the so-called just not dynamic scenario, then very slowly the potential growth will decline, and then it will be reduced to 1% from 1.5%. If we are more active in providing reforms, then I think it's in medium-term perspective, the potential growth will be increased to 2% from 1.5. If we are too dynamic and active, then perhaps the result will be even 3%. I think that really, just as OECD colleagues consider in their reports, these reforms in goods market, a lot of things have already been done. Some projects were launched. So this easing of regulations and different corrections of control, strengthening and of competition. We have special program of development of competition. This is a common knowledge. Then regulation and increasing of effectiveness of public firms is a very feasible project. It's not quick privatization, but introducing additional incentives for these public firms and tight fiscal limitations so that they could not increase the prices of the goods. Some steps have already been done. Another thing is just increasing the pension age. It's not only significant for budget, but this is in fact the factor of investment attractiveness, because investors must understand that in fact the burden of financing aging population will not be theirs. The investment climate will improve. Another important reform, it's just budget reforms, which assumes changing of structure of spendings. So productive spendings are those who in fact influence increasing of potential growth because they increase quality of human capital. In the report of OECD, you didn't look at the problems at labor market, and it seems to me this is just a very big risk for the country, because in fact we entered the stage when the number of population is aging 0.5% per year. I think that the number of workers will decrease, and if we don't take special measures, then it will be a big burden on our potential growth. Luckily, we have reserves for optimizing the number of working population in different sectors. For example, in budget sector, we have some suggestions to finish some reforms in defense ministry and to come to the professional army to increase mobility of labor force. For example, for monacities, I think the correct policy is not to support just aiding the Soviet firms, but to facilitate migration of the population where the labor force is in demand, and perhaps to retrain the working population. So a lot of things that I mentioned are parts of different programs. There are some government programs, but the problem that we face is that very often program is not implemented in words are good, but in life it's not as nice. 2018 year, from this point of view, is rather beneficial. I think that one of our problems is it's a kind of trap of pessimistic ideas. There appeared a lot of works of economists that demonstrate that pessimistic predictions, in fact, result in real low indicators. It seems to me that we are just in this situation. If we don't have optimistic predictions, then we don't have investments and the growth is low, and the situation becomes even worse because recently in 2017, for example, some banks were bankrupt and companies which conducted the activity based on optimistic predictions, such companies, Vimavia, Transara, in fact, shifted predictions to pessimistic forecasts. Still, we have some strong incentives and signals that it's not only our programs that are ambitious, but these ambitious programs are implemented with the same ambitions. Now in pre-election campaign, this is just the right time to declare ambitious programs, but then we need to have the government that will be able to implement these ambitious programs. Only in this case, our potential growth will not be declining, but will be increasing.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask the same question to our IMF colleague.
Fiscal policy influences potential growth on the regional level, in particular the higher the spending, the budget spending, the lower the economic growth. So, Gabriel, you recently published the working paper on fiscal federalism. Could you please comment on also on the question whether the budget expenses influence or not the economic growth on the region level? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Polina, for the question, and for the OECD colleagues for the invitation to participate on this. As you said, I'm going to say just a few words on macro and then try to say a few words about our work on fiscal federalism and growth in the regions. So first, I just want to commend my colleagues of the OECD on their very ambitious agenda and encourage both the Russian authorities and OECD to continue this work. There is a lot that can be done, in particular in bringing Russia closer to what is the legal frameworks of OECD in order to simplify investment. I think that my colleagues of the OECD have made this point. There were accession talks previous that the sanctions were imposed, and the fact that communication between OECD and Russia continues is very encouraging, and I hope it continues in the future, and this work is deepened. Then in terms of the macro, I basically broadly agree with my colleagues. I think that the main point that they make is that there is, we are at the, if you want, at this time, we are at the crossroad. I think that it is very clear that stabilization after the shocks in 2014 has already proceeded. Due to very good policies on the macro side, on the government, the downturn was not very strong, and it's very clear when you compare the downturn after the 2008-2009 crisis, and basically the size of the shocks was similar. I mean, you see the economy collapsing in 2008, and this did not happen in 14 and 15, and this is due to the good policies of the authorities for which they have to be commended. In that regard, I mean, I think that the very small output gap that opened in 15 is probably going to be already closed in 2018. And this implies that really the attention goes back to medium term. I mean, how much this country can grow. I think that the authorities are actually correct in establishing ambitious objectives. I mean, it's very clear that the objective is not for Russia to lose importance in the global economy, and so for that, output per year needs to grow at least 3%. But it's clear also that it seems to be, for a different number of reasons that we're going to discuss, and my colleagues have discussed already, that at least in the next few years, potential growth may be limited at something between around 1.5%. I think that there is agreement on this. And there are a number of issues that explain this. Demographics, as Professor Gurvich explained, is one of them. Low total factor productivity is another one. And we can discuss a little bit more why this is so. But it's clear that at least in the next few years, potential growth is low. And so this brings me to some of the policy issues and analytical issues that my colleagues of the OECD are raising, the first of which is making sure that there is not an oil curse in Russia. And for that, I have to say that the set of reforms that were implemented beginning in 2015 and that were culminated with the approval and signing into law of a new fiscal rule in mid-2017 is an essential cornerstone of policies going forward. And this is so because oil is a curse only if the policies that are followed by the government are basically not the best. If what happens is that every time that there is an increase in oil prices, the increase in oil prices is completely spent and all windfalls are spent, what you have as a consequence is that relative prices fluctuate too much, and this makes completely impossible economic planning, and in particular hurts those industries that are more technology intensive, like those that are in the tradable sector. By approving the fiscal rule, by anchoring this fiscal rule around a realistic oil price that does not fluctuate year after year, what the authorities are trying to do is to provide a strong signal that relative prices going forward are going to be stable, no matter what happens in terms of trade, no matter what happens with the price of oil. And this is essential because this provides the right signal to the tradable sector. This makes investment in the tradable sector, in the non-energy tradable sector, more profitable and makes planning in this sector better. One thing, just footnote that I want to point out, I think that there is no really problem or inconsistency between central bank's policy, that is complete float, inflation targeting, no intervention whatsoever in the foreign exchange rate market, and the purchases of foreign exchange by the government. I mean, the government purchases foreign exchange because this is the way the government has to translate the windfall oil prices, that is, when oil prices are above $40, the government needs to increase their buffers. Their buffers are not denominated in rubles, the buffers are denominated in dollars. Taxes are paid in rubles, so every time that there is a windfall that the government receives in rubles but saves them in dollars, they need to basically effect these foreign exchange purchases. There is absolutely nothing wrong, and there is no inconsistency whatsoever with the policy of the central bank. One issue that is essential, and I agree completely with my colleagues of the OECD, is that inequality is definitely a factor. And for that, I have to say the following. Just think it in very common sense terms. Going forward, how this economy can grow is going to be related on how large the market is in Russia. And to gauge how large the market is in Russia, you need to look at how many people there are going to be. So demographics. Demographics are not particularly positive in Russia for the next 6 or 7 years. It's going to be dependent on how much average income per capita increases, and this is related with productivity, of course, and with capital or infrastructure, but it's also related on how income is distributed. If 1% of the population takes most of the income and the rest of the population does not have a high income per capita, this limits demand. This limits the type of products that Russia can sell domestically. So one thing that I would add as a potentially interesting area of research, and my colleagues pointed out a number of factors that may explain why income per capita in Russia is unequal, and they use the Gini coefficient. What I would say is that it would be important also to look at other measures of income inequality, like what's the proportion of income that accrues to 1%, the top 1 percentile of income earners. And second, I would hypothesize that one part or one possible explanation of income distribution is a very unequal distribution of wealth. And so that could be also one factor. And then in terms of regions, I think that this is also an essential issue for Russia. I think it's completely under-researched. I think more work is needed, and I commend my colleagues of the OECD for doing work on this. I know that the World Bank also has tried to do work on this. It's good, it's encouraging, and I think that this needs to be, there need to be positive spillover from the authority side, and I encourage also the authorities to do more work on analyzing this. I think that in that regard, let me tell you one word why this is important. I mean, when you look at these cross-country charts like my colleagues presented, and you look in the same chart, you put Russia and you put Denmark. You put Russia and you put Austria. I mean, when you look at Denmark's small country, completely integrated. I mean, market is not fragmented, it's a very homogeneous country. You look at Russia, it's a continent. And so clearly there are differences between countries, and in the case of Russia, federalism, this enormous heterogeneity between the geographies, resources, cultures, income per capita of regions is essential to understand how much this economy can grow. So a few points on that related with the paper that Polina was mentioning. First thing is, when you look at what the government is trying to do with the fiscal federalism, first thing is that what they're trying to do is to create a level playing field. When you look at income revenues across different regions, but not the total revenues, but the revenues that each region creates, you see enormous differences. You see regions in which spending is financed 90% by transfers from the federal government, and regions in which 70% or 80% of spending is financed by the federal government. So what has these transfers resulted for the region? So there are two things that we looked in the paper. One positive thing is that what you see is that regions that are poorer, that are receiving more transfers from the federal government, indeed are spending more in education, they are spending more in health. When you look at improvements in education, and by this I mean people completing primary school, secondary school, accessing university, you see consistent improvements in regions that are receiving more transfers from the government. So human capital is increasing. The other thing that you see is that regions receiving more transfers are actually investing more. So ratios of investment as a ratio of regional GRPs is higher in lower income regions. So basically, if you think in terms of a production function, you have that in terms of inputs of production, human capital is increasing more in low income regions, and capital is increasing more in low income regions. But what you have as a result is then that when you look at income per capita in 1998 and income per capita in 2015, you see that the difference between rich and poor regions in 1998 was exactly the same as the difference between income per capita in 2015, meaning that these regions invested more, received more human capital, but still could not catch up with the richer regions. So what's going on? So what we saw then was the structure of production. We look at the supply side, and what we observed is that in the regions that are receiving more transfers, the public sector is larger. This is actually natural to expect at the beginning. So if the region is receiving more transfers, it should increase spending in education and health, should increase spending in investment. And so initially, the share of the public sector in the regional economy should increase. But it is not necessarily the case that after a 15-year period, you should observe an expansion, a continuous expansion of the share of the government. There should be some spillovers from the public sector to the private sector. You don't see that. The other thing that you see is an increasing concentration in Russia. Russia's population stayed more or less constant from 1998 to 2015. Still, the city of Moscow's population increased by 30%, and the population in St. Petersburg increased by 10%. And in some regions, population decreased in the order of 15 to 20%, meaning that markets are decreasing in size, that the cost of providing infrastructures in the regions is higher, and so there is an issue for the government, because in the end, the regions that are expelling population, where private sectors are not increasing that much, are going to be continually dependent on the federal budget. So I'm posing questions that require more answers. Just let me give you a couple of very humble recommendations that we have made in the paper. The first thing is that when you look at horizontal distributions, there may be more room to work here. And the government is working, granted, on this. I mean, if you look at what they have done in the last couple of years, there is 1 percentage point, I think 1 percentage point, Polina can correct me, or 2 percentage points of the corporate income tax that is being diverted from the richer regions to the poorer regions. And I think this is something that can be institutionalized. I mean, done in the margin, continuous, because I think that horizontal distribution of revenues can be improved. Second thing is to tax more wealth and properties. The city of Moscow has begun to do this. This recommendation also by the OECD, more can be done. Third thing is try to very slowly and on the margin break pattern of dependence from the federal government. So maybe in the formulas that the government uses to distribute resources, more weight can be done to sustainability of the federal budgets. With that, I stop, and thanks so much for the questions.
Thank you. И сейчас у нас есть, наверное, буквально несколько минут для вопросов.
Thank you, and I think we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Thank you. My name is Dmitry Schulz. I belong to the Center for Economic Infrastructure. I have a few technical questions. Question number one concerns the first slides. I understand that our OECD colleagues are not just expecting a very low growth, they are expecting negative growth. So my question is, how did you arrive to such a negative forecast? On the second presentation, I have a few technical questions. The instrumental method that you used, what instruments did you use in your calculations? I failed to see the tools in the slide. On oil price, you used the oil price, but did you use the exchange rate? So did you use oil price denominated in dollars or in rubles? And finally, the request for a comment. When spatial development of Russia, the models for Russia's spatial development is being developed, we're working on mathematical modeling, and we pay specific attention for investment multipliers. We've never used panel regressions, but we discovered that investment multipliers are extremely diverse across regions. I have seen that you used 0.2 coefficient. It seems that it's like 2 average. Our studies show that investment multiplier factors are almost 0 in some regions and as much as 0.7 in others. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, the multiplier is 0.3, 0.4. What I mean is that regions are extremely diverse, and the use of panel regressions might lead you to losing sight of this diversity. Simplifying the model. Thank you.
So I will try to answer the first two ones. First on potential growth. Indeed, I mean, potential growth is notoriously difficult to define, and it involves a lot of calculations. The OECD model simply, potential growth is based on total factor productivity, which is a residual. Sorry, or did I misunderstand your question?
I meant I don't mean potential growth. I meant total factor productivity and its use for forecasting.
Total factor productivity, which finally defines potential growth, is notoriously difficult to calculate. And in our case, or in the Russian case, the fact that it declined so strongly between 2000 and 2014 probably affects the calculations for 2000, 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. I would guess personally that the total factor productivity is not negative, but it is close to 0, meaning that if you rise it to around 0, that potential growth, and again I'm coming back to growth, would then mean that potential growth rises to around 1%, maximum 1.5%. Does that answer your question? You still want to know why total factor productivity is negative, which is true. I don't have the slides here. It's right. Total factor productivity in our calculations is negative. But as I said, it's a way of calculating, and this calculation relies on the strong decline over the past years. Yeah.
Как строился прогноз?
Yeah, the prognosis, the forecast. The forecast, it's a linked calculation. So if it declined in the past, it's partially.
То есть экстраполяция.
Whereas you extrapolate, you project.
Assuming no policy change, so it's purely model based. The second question is on the oil price and the exchange rate. Because the oil price is essentially a world price, we assumed the dollar price, so we don't work with exchange rates. We took one of the world oil prices. I don't know whether it's Brent or another one, but in any case, it is a dollar. It is a dollar price.
Да, спасибо.
Thank you very much for your questions. There was a question on the methods of the calculation model. There are two types of instruments. One instrument was based on factors calculated for preceding periods. We tried to adjust. There is another type of tools in this method. We can use our indicators or we can use other people's indicators, so we used our own calculations. As to endogeneity, what I didn't explain is that some of the indicators come from the past and continue to impact the current period and the future. And also, some of the figures are adjusted and filtered so as to adjust for short-term features that may be related to short-term peculiarities. So we try to filter out short-term factors a little. In fact, these multipliers are not all that diverse across regions. We have done many comparative studies of regions over several factors, so we did expect major differences. In fact, it's a matter of what we wanted to focus on. We're talking about the impact of a policy on federal policy on regional growth and regions. We didn't want to compare regions. That's why we used the panel analysis. But of course, some diversity is shown even here. Would be very interested to focus on it.
To proceed the topic of regional development, we have a person who is involved in research on innovative regions, and I would ask you to comment the results and factors which in fact are taken into account in ratings of regions, and how do you calculate the impact of regional policy on all other factors. Please use the microphone. Good morning. My name is Rosa Simeonova. I'm the leader of Association of Innovative Regions, and I would ask you to give the presentation. I would like to say a few words about our activities, and this is rating of innovative regions of Russia. We did this job in 2012. Originally, that was the task which was set in 2010 by the Ministry of Economic Development. And in fact, that was within the framework of supporting innovative regions and providing different incentive for development for these innovative regions. And then the research task was, in fact, shifted to more applied task of working out measures of regional policy. This instrument was modified. That was just the instrument which, in fact, was modified. And what is important that in terms of forming methodology and choice of indicators, the regions themselves took part in this research because they were interested in the instrument that would include indicators interesting for the regions and for comparison between the regions. Though the idea comes from the top, then in fact the initiatives came from the regions themselves. I think this is very important to consider at the moment. Practical result of this rating is just different reports. Rating is the result of research of all regions, but we emphasize the position of 14 regions which are members of this association. Our association was established in 2007. Originally we had only 8 regions and now we have 14. The slide shows the main findings. We concentrated on these members of association. The first place takes Moscow and Petersburg. This year Petersburg takes the first place and Moscow takes the second place. Then the third place, Tatarstan, Tomsk region. So the position is stable. Novosibirsk takes the 5th position. Then Kaluga, the 6th position, and the position is also stable. So these 6 regions kept their position, and they are real leaders and benchmark for other regions in innovative development. Ulyanovsk region takes the 8th place, Samara the 9th, but Ulyanovsk has made tremendous progress. They moved to the top. The Bashkortostan are very strong in developing innovative things, though it takes 13th place. Tyumen 14th, Krasnoyarsk 14th, and Perm region 15th or 18th, Lipetsk 21, and so Irkutsk and Altaysky region have just the average position. As for the basis for our research, we used European methodology, and in fact, in terms of methodology and defining groups, in fact, we copied the models used in Europe. The choice of basic blocks and indicators also just copied European model. In the first block, we had 9 indicators which indicate research potential and potential for innovation. The block of innovative activities includes indicators, also 9 indicators, which evaluate different aspects of innovative activities and of organizations. It's introducing the innovations, and the third block, I also have to mention that we looked at spendings on innovation. This is one of the indicators. The third block is social economic environment. It's 5 indicators. Some indicators are outdated. Yesterday we got recommendations to delete the indicator for computerization. We tried to modify the structure and adapt it to current situation and demand in specific regions. Yesterday we launched a new research and introduced a new block which evaluates different parameters of regional innovative policy, as well as parameters of innovative activities of authorities. It's rather creative, it's being discussed, and whether we should include it or not is also a debatable issue at the moment. We discuss this question with regions. We try to define whether it is necessary or not, but now we are about to make a decision that this is a topical issue, and we can continue to develop it. I would also want to mention the instrument that we use for working out recommendations. So this diagram helps us to show pros and cons of all aspects, relative growth in different innovative directions. For example, in Ulyanovsk region, you can see it on the slide. We see growth, benefits or failures of these regions, and we develop just report and recommendations for this region. In this table, we show the positions of all regions. If you're interested in specific regions, you may look at the information. This algorithm of forming this rating is borrowed from methodology of Eurostat, OECD. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that in addition to the importance of this indicator for policy solutions and government administration, it's also has great academic value, seeing as it involves a number of a lot of data from various fields, and is also valuable for building forecasts. Thank you. Yes, I also wanted to note that we'd be interested in applied practical use of our findings, also for academic use. We only have one question, time for one question. Your question, please. I have two. On Tatarstan, what is the major driver of its innovative growth? Have you in introduction of informatics technologies, it's only one of the indicators. It's not a key indicator, though. So I think the main driver is innovative activity by regional authorities. We have looked at our economic growth from regional perspective, but we have failed to look at the sectoral factors. And in fact, sectoral analysis is just as important, specifically the housing market, which has grown very well, mortgaging. We have a report on housing by Mikhail Goldberg, which might throw some light on this issue. Mikhail, yes, good afternoon. Good morning. In fact, I want to talk about the housing market, including construction and mortgaging. Housing is an important factor. It has been included in OECD survey of urban development and housing. As for the growth of the market since 2012, the mortgage market as a part of the general overall market, financial market, has demonstrated positive growth, especially in the last 2 years, when the mortgage market has been recovering after the crisis. especially given the unprecedented decrease of rates. 1 year ago, rates were as high as 13% annual. At the end of 17, and they have dropped to 9.5%. We have some record indicators. 1.1 million mortgages have been made on almost twofold growth. Few financial markets have demonstrated such excellent growth rates, particularly laudable in view of the general slump on the market. Very large growth in terms of housing construction. There is a little lag in terms of responding to overall macroeconomic change. And paradoxically, maximum growth was achieved at the time of the crisis. But that's because the construction started a couple of years before the crisis. But still, the results are very good, particularly in view of the differences of Russia's housing market compared to countries with old market economies. Our housing market was only born in 1990. Despite this positive growth, the housing sector is now facing a number of challenges: low quality of urban environment, low quality of existing housing, explained by poor, unsatisfactory approaches to urban planning in the past, considerable administrative barriers, even though they have been declining. Consents and other administrative and bureaucratic procedures continue to act as a serious barrier to housing construction. We are aware that on the 20th of December, the President had a meeting with actors to consider the main strategies for the development of housing, and the main incentives are going to include in future continued development of mortgage market and a reform that will eventually lead to an instant development of the market for renting, for rent. So far, the rent of housing space is a gray area, giving no income to government, without any protections for landowners, for owners and clients. And the development of this market opens great prospects. Government strategy also includes increasing housing construction by public housing construction. Another important factor for increasing accessibility of housing, because this will allow to decrease the mortgage costs. The plan is that mortgages will be accessible to more than 50% of Russian families in 2015, which we think is a very feasible target, given greater development of mortgage instruments, including securities and urban development programs, improving outdated housing and building new housing, new spaces. As for urban environment, it's very important to develop new standards for urban development, hopefully in the form of a legislative base, a body of legislation based on social development plans, so that an urban development plan would answer all kinds of challenges from territorial balance and designs and street planning. Why is it so important for OECD to pay attention to urban development and the public policy in this area? We know that urbanization is one of the key trends of our time. Most global GDP is created in 500 major cities. And we can see that even though the level of urbanization in Russia is a little lower than in the United States, it more or less corresponds to average OECD. However, in our estimates, the input of 17 biggest urban areas into Russia's GDP is about 37%. This slide demonstrates data for all cities with 100,000 population or bigger. Statistics shows that large agglomerations include more than 50% of mortgages and new housing. Naturally, that's where demand for housing space is the biggest, and that these cities will be economic drivers generally and housing drivers specifically. The importance of this is not of recent origin. Starting in 2016, Russia's had a national program for developing mortgage market and housing. Last year, a mechanism was created for one tranche, one-time mortgage credits by banks that will allow to facilitate mortgages for end users. This program by central bank has been to the value of more than 100 million rubles. Another project has been public housing in Moscow, housing project in Moscow, which has been extremely successful, with huge waiting lines for each flat. The construction ministry with together with two private companies, developed standards for urban environment based on OECD standards, and we hope that this document will become a beacon for urban development in Russia generally. Russia is a member in various international surveys and indicators, Unfortunately, Russia's ranking is quite low in these indicators, specifically in terms of housing per family. Russia, but on the other hand, Russia's position in terms of housing per capita is not bad. And we hope that these new programs will allow for Russia to take a better position in all these rankings, including the quality of cities and the quality of urban environment. That's why we want to continue interaction with OECD in terms of harmonizing methodologies and joint studies. A practical issue for OECD is also that we propose that in the next 2 years we'll hold a joint study with OECD of the housing market and prepare a review of housing and urban environment, such as you did in Kazakhstan last year. Thank you for your attention, and I'm willing to answer any questions you may have. Thank you. I want to note that it's a very interesting subject for study. Would be happy to facilitate it. We have several people in this room involved in developing strategy for spatial development, and I wanted them to say a few words on the importance of urban environment and its development, as well as several other key aspects.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for organizers for this possibility just to speak here. I will give some remarks. I will try to respond to what was mentioned. My name is Zemlyansky, Moscow City University. I'll start with geographic factors, with very general factors. New economic geography teaches us a very simple idea that there are two groups of geographic factors: tough factors that in fact limit spatial development and we are not able to influence on them. Resources. For example, in Tverskoy we don't have sea, we don't have oil, and it cannot develop in the same direction as oil extracting regions. But still there are some factors which may be changed in time and we may influence these factors. This is increasing of efficiency and productivity connected with concentration of population, with the development of infrastructure and effect rooted in certain institutions. When we consider forecast or prediction and with focus on regional development, we can't but not consider these factors. Today, colleagues didn't look at the way they take into account, but it's within the framework of this special development program that is a part of Ministry of Economic Development program. We see that our country is very diversified and the regions depend not only on natural resources, but in fact they depend on concentration of population, on some migration and demographic factors. And then continuing the idea, if you are agglomerate and if you develop, whether you develop with public support or not, so increasing the integration and connectiveness with the capital may influence your development. But if you are located 300 kilometers from the central government, then you don't have this basic spatial development. These differences are extremely important in regional forecasts. Simple example is the region of Tatarstan, which originally used resource then agglomerative factors, and today focuses on development of human capital. And in fact, this is very reasonable model. I hope that our colleagues took into account these factors. Then perhaps the figures may be different and the effect in different regions is different, but still all factors are very important. What should regional forecast give us? So in fact, to show the direction of development of economic development. If we look at two presentations of our colleagues from OECD, we see both declining and at the same time just excluding high differences in income inequality. So under circumstances of shortage of resources, we are not able just to use equally all the measures for all regions. Perhaps in short-term perspective, we have perhaps not to be too tough in considering this income inequality, but we would rather concentrate on supporting just a trend for increasing productivity. If we take into account infrastructure, and if we look at the results of the groups, research groups, then perhaps 2/3 of economic growth is made by 23% of the territory, and Moscow provides 17.5% of this growth. So these are separate points, but we have to identify them and realize that, in fact, in some places there are limitations for growth. It may be rooted in lack of public financing, because now we shifted financing to the Far East. Some regions are not in the center of government because their problems are not regional problems, but even interregional. So then, managing economic growth, we have to pay special attention to territories which will provide maximum effect. I don't mean to say that we must ignore other regions, but as research of Oecd shows, that investment sometimes do not increase growth, then perhaps we should focus on social policies in the regions which are important for Far East, for North Caucasus, for rural areas, for small cities which are located not in the agglomerates and where businesses cannot be developed. Then we should focus not on economic things, but on social factors. And just to finish my talk, I would like to say that working on the strategy of spatial development, we faced a dilemma. Yes, there are some good methods of macroeconomic development, and we may create decomposition of this model on regional level, or how to distribute this growth on different regions. But then, in fact, we kill initiatives of regions. I think that we have to bear in mind that, in fact, nobody could predict Kaluga development, but regional incentives, regional ideas, in fact, resulted in dynamic growth of this region. Thank you very much for attention. Thank you. So in fact, we exceed our time, and still we have one question that we didn't manage to discuss. We looked at drivers of growth. We looked in terms of domestic economy, but perhaps we would look at the drivers of economic growth in international perspective and export potential of Russian economy and diversification of export, which is in fact the other side of the coin. We have Andrei Nikolaevich, and I would like to give a floor to him and just to comment on this question.
Yeah.
Dear colleagues, we in Russia have one of the few tools for supporting this sector, which, as you know, has been in decline starting 2016. Due to unfavorable changes in trade, both export and import prices, Russia has lost more than $250 billion, which is comparable to all exports in 2016, total exports in 2016, barring natural products. At that time, government started several programs to support exports of manufacturers, including the use of best practices recommended by OECD. We have a great potential. No other country in the world, you will agree, has such great diversity of multi-level competitive advantages. We have it all. We can offer both primary products, resources, but also high-tech products. We are aware that Russia contributes more than 10% of food and industrial goods, but we also offer various high-tech and goods and intellectual products and intellectual services. That's about 1/4 of all exports of manufacturers. Of course, it's what we have predominating is military and nuclear power goods, but we also export intellectual services, technologies, and building up to a considerable segment with increasing diversity. Formally, the diversification of Russian exports has been growing, both in terms of export structure and revenues from exports, as well as an empirical study of our exports. Our exports to China have been becoming more diverse, especially in view of the different changes in China's domestic demand. We send food there, we export food there, metal products for construction and other products. And we still have great reserves, great potential. We agree with the OECD that exports is one of the major growth points for Russia. And there is much that can be done. Russia is already using most tools for supporting exports that are available, but at regional level, the situation could be improved. There is a review of best practices that has been done and sent down to regional levels. There are some tasks of export support measures for innovation sectors where export projects should be supported at R&D stage, at on the shop floor sometimes. There's been a decision to create a government office, a government department with funds to support such projects at their origin. Better regulations are going to be adopted, including lifting restrictions in terms of antitrust law, anti-monopoly rules, and so on, in view of strict oversight by receiving countries. Tax procedures can be simplified, and so on. In other words, there is a lot of measures that can be applied, but they are quite clear and they're underway. I have to thank you. I want to thank you for noting the importance of productivity, even in existing companies, which really is a result of failure to invest in modernization and innovation. Even though Russia's made advances in the doing business ranking and in terms of improving the business environment, but there's still a lot to be done. I remember a 10-year-old poll of various countries where, in terms of measures for improving competitiveness, most countries said these measures include support of innovation. Russian companies said they try to reduce costs. So if we talk in terms of prospects for joint studies with OECD, I think an interesting field would be to look at competitiveness at micro level, at firm level, to determine what government measures, what policy measures might facilitate better competitiveness at firm level. You're quite right in saying that macro indicators are all good. And there is clarity as to what structural reforms should be conducted. On the other hand, I think that at micro level, it's still unclear what measures are needed for competitiveness. And that's a great field for study. And finally, on regional development, there's also a lot of potential for study. Across Russia, as far as I remember, experts are forecasting faster growth of major cities, meaning that a lot of Russia's territory is going to break up into several major cities with empty territory in between. And that will create difficulties in terms of territorial development and growth, especially the use of natural resources, water, and so on. We need to make sure that our agricultural sector supports the so-called virtual water. And in conclusion, I want to express my gratitude to OECD to our colleagues, the speakers today, for their presentation. You made so important points that we need to study, and we do hope for future joint work. Thank you, Andrei. I don't think there is any need for a conclusion. You've made such a good summary of today's proceedings. Thank you, everyone. everyone. Thank you for your interest. Bye.